Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Michael Johnny. I'm going to be the host of our webinar this afternoon. Given the fact that we have 1 hour, I thought we would start as close to the top of the hour as possible. Today's session, as you can read by the title, is around institutional knowledge mobilization planning. We're very privileged to have Dr. Stephen MacGregor joining us. He's had a long-standing relationship with this network, which we're excited and proud of. I want to thank the team at Research Impact Canada for their help in facilitating today. Given the fact we have an hour, I will be facilitating a Q&A session once Stephen is done. And I need to acknowledge the fact that we may not get through all of your questions, so I apologize for that. I will read a land acknowledgement. I'm joining today from my home office in Burlington, Ontario. And given the fact that we're not all convened in the same location, I will read that right now. Burlington, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nation and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Haudenosaunee and Métis, our lands spanning from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment are steeped in Indigenous history. The territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Ojibwe, Iroquois Confederacy, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We would like to acknowledge that the land I'm on today, joining is part of the treaty land and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Let's see what other, well, I will pass it over to Stephen, but as I mentioned, it is a long-standing relationship which we've had with Stephen all the way back to when he was a PhD candidate at Queen's. Now he's, as you can see on the slide, associate professor at the University of Calgary within their School of Education. So Stephen, on behalf of all of us today, thank you very much for making the time to join us. And we're very excited about your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. As Michael was so kind in his introduction to mention, I'm an assistant, not associate yet. Hopefully, fingers crossed, in the coming year or so, at the Workman School of Education within the University of Calgary. And a significant part of my research, as Michael gave in the introduction there, focuses on knowledge mobilization, especially how institutions support or sometimes struggle to support the use of research in ways that are meaningful, relational, grounded in context. And so that's the work that I'll be talking about today. Specifically, this session is going to bring together some research along with insights from across the Research Impact Canada network. And we're going to work through or explore how institutions are approaching knowledge mobilization planning and what we can learn from some of the patterns, some of the tensions, and some of the possibilities that are emerging from institutions that are a part of Research Impact Canada, but also those that extend beyond it. And so with that, we'll jump right in. What I'm going to do in the chat is, if I can find that button, I'm going to drop some documents into the chat that I hope will be useful. They're also linked here on the first page. But if you'd like to follow along, there's the slides. They'll be popping up in the chat any minute. And as we go a little bit further, I have another resource document to share. But for now, let's get going. So many of you are already deep in this work. And that's whether you hold a formal knowledge mobilization role, whether you find yourself navigating through it in everyday practice. My aim isn't to define what knowledge mobilization should look like. Instead, the plan for today is to surface some of the patterns emerging across institutions, and then to use those hopefully to take something back into your own context. And so the question might be, why now? Why this sort of webinar at this point in time? We're at a moment when expectations on universities continue to shift. You know, for years, we've seen many different sources lamenting the growing pressure, whether that's from funders, from communities, often from inside our own institutions, that are asking us not just to produce knowledge, but to make it useful, to make it accessible and relevant. And at the same time, institutional approaches to knowledge mobilization are all over the place. Some have mature strategies, others are just starting up. And across the board, we're still working out how to do this well, not just in terms of the tools and processes that we use, but also in how we explore the space of institutional planning for knowledge mobilization. And so across the board, we're still working out how to do this well. And the culture, in moving towards where we're building a culture that genuinely supports impact, we have to recognize that it's not actually just shaped by frameworks. It's shaped by how we talk about impact and knowledge mobilization, how we recognize it, and how we hold space for different understandings of what it means. If you're part of the network, you know that this isn't common parlance necessarily across even Research Impact Canada. And so it pays dividends to spend some time in thinking about how we approach these and how different groups are approaching it. Specifically around what we'll explore, I'll walk us through one institutional journey, and this is a composite case drawn from recent research that was led with a number of colleagues from Research Impact Canada. It reflects the real challenges and decisions that are faced by many research-intensive universities, although I think the implications will be broadly applicable, not just to university settings. And in this university, in how it's working to make its knowledge mobilization efforts more intentional. But the story is just a way in, right? So what I really want to share are 7 lessons that are connected to it. And so it's sort of the vehicle to get there. And those lessons are the patterns that we've been seeing across institutions. And what we learn from them aren't meant to be prescriptions or even best practices necessarily. There's a lot of work still to do in that area. They're working insights, and each is paired with things like tensions and prompts, and something hopefully practical to take forward, as you'll see. And so that's the plan. Now, there's going to be a number of things along the way. I'm not going to throw people into breakout rooms or anything like that. I know sometimes you just want to come to a webinar and listen, but if you do want to engage a little bit further in some of the questions that are prompting along the way, I'm going to use this tool called Slido. Some may be familiar with it. It makes it really easy just to both add your thoughts to the conversation as it moves along and to see what other people are thinking. If you join at this link and then just leave it open on your phone or your computer, once we get to a prompt, it'll just come up automatically for you. So you can follow along that way if you like. And the first question I want to pose to everybody is, in one word, how would you describe your institution's approach to knowledge mobilization? And there's no wrong answer here. It could be anything that captures the reality for you right now. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, and you can submit multiple words if we want to build this out a bit further. But we're already seeing lots of diversity in where people are starting from. So let's hold on to that complexity as we move forward. And this is a really interesting assortment of words. So hopefully we can maybe move towards something in a positive direction from fragmented and scattered or siloed. So there's some ideas that we can share. Okay, thank you so much. So we'll move on from this, but let's hold on to some of these. Okay, but before we get there, I do want to preempt very briefly, just to give you a sense again of where this is coming from, to ground the story. So it's not a case study in the traditional sense. It is a composite narrative. So that means that it's drawn from real Canadian universities that I've studied with Research Impact Canada through an environmental scan and some other research that we've been doing. I'll just allude to in a second. I'm not going to get into methods and all of that sort of thing. But the point is here that it's anonymized, but it's real. And chances are that parts of it will feel familiar. So let me introduce you to Midland University. It's a mid-sized, research-intensive Canadian institution. About 5 years ago, Midland U released a new strategic plan. You know, for many of these in senior leadership, it was felt to be a bold, forward-looking, and deeply committed plan to societal impact. It referenced terms like knowledge exchange, community relevance, and impact. And knowledge mobilization was woven into the vision, but it wasn't fully defined. So at first there was energy. A few champions stepped up who offered things like workshops, created templates for grant applications, even a small internal fund to build public engagement. So there was momentum, but it was uneven. And then, as often happens, that initial spark ran into some familiar friction points. First, diffusion of responsibility. Everyone was encouraged to do knowledge mobilization, but nobody quite knew who was supposed to lead it. Faculties interpreted it differently. One hired, for example, a comms officer. We've seen things like this. Another handed the work to graduate students. Second, there was ambition that was outpacing support. And so the goals were ambitious, but the infrastructure wasn't there yet. A researcher, for example, might be trying to build policy partnerships, but had no brokerage support. Or an evaluation officer wanted to start tracking impact, but they were unsure what even to measure. And then third, there was also these cultural tensions that were at play. Some researchers welcomed the focus on relevance, whereas others feared it would be a constraint on scholarly freedom or just become a new metric to be gained. Now, over time, Midland U adapted, as institutions do. They moved beyond this sort of broad mention of knowledge mobilization in their research strategy. They created a standalone plan. They hired a full knowledge mobilization lead. This may sound like pie in the sky, but there are some institutions moving this way. And they launched a community of practice, part learning hub, part support network, and people were feeling now that they weren't just figuring this out alone. But probably the most important part, and we see this in some contexts, is that there was a conceptual shift in that they stopped seeing knowledge mobilization as just this administrative requirement and started treating it as a cultural and ethical commitment, something that needs to grow with the institution, reflect different forms of knowledge, and that needs to stay responsive to the local context and the community of the institution. And so that kind of journey, starting with good intentions, running into bumps and slowly building more thoughtful, integrated approach is something we've seen play out in a number of institutions. And so with Midland U, as our anchor, we're going to walk through those 7 lessons, as I mentioned, and hopefully land on some patterns and some possibilities you might adapt to your own setting. So that's the plan. And if you're interested, this is going to be a very, very short slide, just so you know. Before we get into lessons, I want you to also know this work isn't just grounded in a case that seems to come from nowhere. It is truly drawn from a really broad set of activities. So we've done an environmental scan of institutional documents. We've conducted many different interviews with Research Impact Canada members over time, over a number of years. We've had ongoing conversations and interactions between my research team and the evaluation and professional development committees, and continuing work with Dr. David Phipps on how strategies actually get built and revised. So it's been an iterative and collective process, and hopefully today's session you'll see reflects that spirit. So let's get into the first lesson, one that often gets overlooked, surprisingly. This is starting with purpose and not just positioning. And so what does that mean? Many institutional strategies, what we see, mention knowledge mobilization or research impact. It shows up sort of like Midland U in the vision statement or in the grant messaging or in community partnerships. But often it's this sort of vague nod to making a difference without defining what kind, for whom, or how success will be known. In this case of Midland U, Midland U's early research plan used all the right words, as I mentioned, right? They had impact, they had relevance, they had community engagement, but what they lacked was specificity. Was this end goal policy change? Was it practice improvement? Was it increased commercial uptake of research? Without that clarity, their early actions were scattered. And so different faculties, as I mentioned, interpreted knowledge mobilization in different ways. One assumed maybe it meant public lectures, another hired a tech transfer officer, and the result was energy but not alignment. By contrast, what we see through some of our environmental scan efforts is there are universities that are really starting to do this quite well. And so when I deviate from Midland U and highlight an example, it's a positive example, because I'm not going to critique openly some of the challenges the real universities are actively working through. We'll highlight the positives. So the University of British Columbia, admittedly, this plan is a bit dated given the date of today's webinar, but they offered a really strong example of clarity and coherence. And so their knowledge mobilization strategy was explicitly linked to both their institutional strategic plan and core initiatives of the Indigenous strategic plan. And so that upfront alignment helped ground their knowledge mobilization efforts in clear and reciprocal purposes and principles. And we've heard that in my research team when we've talked with people from UBC. And so reinforce this sort of shared understanding of what success looks like and how it connects to those broader institutional goals, rather than sitting as this sort of standalone, obscure document. But getting there is not always straightforward. And so as a nod in that direction of how do we get there, there was a review that I'm going to mention here that looked at institutional strategies in the broader literature by Mark Reed and his team. And they found two common, what they called archetypes for knowledge mobilization planning. The first was this idea of achieving strategies, and the other was enabling strategies. And so this is the first sort of point at which we might think about what kind of strategy does our institution need. Achieving strategies are those that are typically goal-driven and they're outcome-oriented. So they'll feature things like structured implementation plans. They'll have an emphasis on partnerships, maybe with government or industry. They'll have success measured through clear, tangible outputs like policy change or uptake. And the idea here is that these strategies work best in institutions with high knowledge mobilization capacity right now and with clear alignment. So places like UBC. Where they can falter if they're overly top down, focusing only on those measurable outcomes, or incentivize sort of superficial engagement. That's that idea of gaming, new forms of gaming, academic achievement. On the other side, enabling strategies, these are created with the intention of creating the conditions for impact. And so they'll emphasize things like culture and capacity building, recognition of diverse types of impact, structural alignment with researcher motivations. So they'll often appear, for lack of a better word, softer, but they're typically more sustainable, especially in sort of complex or emerging contexts where that direct application piece isn't obvious. And so how would you actually use this distinction is something I think people are still, wrestling with. But the questions I would say that are most useful to grapple with around this breakdown is, what kind of culture are you trying to grow? So are you supporting authentic, grounded knowledge mobilization, or expecting compliance given other circumstances that may be at play? And so you can use sort of Mark Reed's framework to think about auditing your current strategy, where it aligns with these two, identifying opportunities to maybe take from pieces of both models, as they actually found in their paper, many places do. And also to advocate for planning that's inclusive, that's adaptive, depending on the local context. In practice, what we see is that the most effective strategies, which I would put a very large asterisk beside because this is still very early as an area of study, start with those enabling conditions and then build towards achieving impact with, but not necessarily through people. To build on that, the question of what kind of impact we value most is really important as starting to think about those early stages of building an impact. And getting clear on it can shape everything, what you measure, what you invest in, how you celebrate success, and questions as well. Things like, are we focused on growing or improving public services, supporting local innovation? And the idea is that those aren't just those abstract goals, but they're going to point to different ways of working and different ways of evidencing impact. And unless we talk about it openly, it's easy for people to work at cross purposes, even when they're all trying to do the right thing. And so one example that I think is really useful here is DORA's building blocks for impact. If you're familiar with DORA, you've probably stumbled across this tool that they have at some point. It's a fairly simple tool, but it encourages institutions to start naming what kinds of impact matter most to them, and then to think about how their structures and incentives reflect that. Yeah, nothing flashy, it's just a clear foundation. And so with this first step, what I want to ask, a question to put to the audience here is, oh, my Slido did not open up for that one. Okay, that's all right, we'll skip by it, we probably had too many anyway. So once the purpose is clear, then even small steps can carry a lot of weight. So that's where we're going to go next. So this one's for anyone who's working in a context where resources are tight, priorities are crowded, and formal knowledge mobilization planning feels out of reach. because another part of the truth here that for any institution that's struggling at the strategy development stage is that you don't need a finished strategy to get started. And so, in fact, some of the most effective knowledge mobilization momentum that we've seen began with these really modest, well-aligned, and low-burden supports. And so, on this first point around early momentum, if we go back to Midland U, long before they had a formal knowledge mobilization framework, and this is the kinds of things we were seeing at other institutions throughout RIC, is that they piloted something like a microgrant program, maybe something like $2,500 here or $5,000 here. And this was for faculty or for graduate students to develop knowledge mobilization outputs with non-academic partners, the real important or operative word there being with. And one project might be something like a community advisory circle around a research study or a short video series for practitioners. And none of these were flashy outputs, but they created, they started down the road of new habits, internal champions, and visible examples of what knowledge mobilization could look like in practice. And for many people, when we spoke to them, these became early wins or proof points that they could use for advocating for more structure, more staffing, and more support. And so if you're wondering about what kinds of roles or activities can help spark that momentum, the framework I often turn back to is Amanda Cooper's framework on brokering functions. She was my doctoral supervisor, and this framework is one that we've used in many different cases and studies. And what it does is identify things like building partnerships or making research more accessible or supporting implementation. And the idea here is that through this framework, we can start to identify some small actions that touch on one or two of what she calls brokering functions. Again, things like a mini grant or a simple tool or drop-in sessions that can play a strategic role in laying that framework for more involved action. And then what I would say, and as an addendum to that, is that from our cross-institutional scan, there's a number of small-scale interventions I want to share that seem to have outsized ripple effects. Things like embedding knowledge mobilization field in internal grant applications and actually working with faculty to understand how they can take up some of the activities that they're considering. Adding a checkbox for things like non-academic dissemination to ethics forums, really small but feasible steps. Creating things like a digital library of knowledge mobilization tools or exemplars, and appointing a knowledge mobilization champion. And it doesn't have to be a full-time equivalent. It could be something just as recognition. And what those are not structural overhauls for most institutions, but they do start to change the texture of institutional practice. And of course, that small change doesn't always mean strategic. And so the key is to align these early supports with purpose. And then, because without that alignment, we're going to, again, find that these efforts feel like noise. And so we want to think of it this way. Every small support is a signal about what counts in your research institution's culture. With that, I want to pause for a moment and ask, what's one small but meaningful support, or it might just be a signal at this point, your institution has tried or that you've wished for? Community of practice, case studies, some really strong examples of some of these in the RIC network. Institutional grants and funding. Excellent. Yeah, I love seeing these examples come in because they really do span from things like small internal grants to things that I was mentioning, like champions of this work. And they really are some of these well-aligned and smart moves that start to shift the institutional picture. And as I said, and so just again, here's the broader point. You don't have to wait for the big plan to begin to start changing culture. And what we've seen is that in some of these institutions that now are further along, it's those small scale purpose aligned moves that start to precede the strategy and lay the groundwork for its eventual, fingers crossed success. All right, I'm going to move on from this one. All right, you've probably heard this before, this next one. It's often a quote that's attributed to Peter Drucker. He phrases it a little bit different, and it can sound kind of cliche, but it's one of the most important realities of institutional knowledge mobilization work. And because here's the core insight: no matter how, what's the right word, elegant your strategy, if it runs counter to the actual culture of your institution, it won't stick. And so if we return to this case of Midland View, they launched their first formal knowledge mobilization plan with fanfare. There was a steering committee. It was printed on a nice glossy PDF. New language associated with grant guidance, but implementation, it largely faltered. And that's because faculty didn't believe the plan valued or that the university valued engagement unless it showed up in tenure and promotion. Because service units didn't see knowledge mobilization as part of their job function. And because early career scholars were more worried that talking about impact would label them as potentially less rigorous. And so these are the sorts of things we not only see right now in many of our institutions, but we see very well grounded in the research. And so the strategy said one thing, but the culture signaled something else. And that disconnect is what stalled momentum. And this is, I think, where the idea of something like impact literacy can be really helpful. And so Bailey and Phipps, that's this big triangle framework here on the right. They suggest that impact literacy isn't just this individual skill, it's also institutional. And so if an institution rolls out a plan without building shared understanding of what we collectively mean when we talk about knowledge mobilization or impact, for example, how it works, who's responsible, then even a really well conceived and strong strategy can fall flat. And so in this idea around incentives are not equal to identity, some institutions respond to that tension by introducing incentives. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and they often get a bad rap, but culture really isn't changed by a travel grant or a checkbox. Those are important, maybe first steps, but that's not how we get to culture change. And so research shows actually that relying too heavily on those extrinsic motivators can crowd out intrinsic commitment, and especially among those who see knowledge mobilization as a civic or ethical practice. And so the institutions that seem to be making a real shift in terms of doing something different, they're supporting communities of practice, they're enabling storytelling, they're amplifying peer leadership, and they're, most importantly around individual practice, helping researchers see themselves as agents of change through knowledge mobilization, not just as those knowledge producers. And so that connects again back to impact literacy, not just when people have this tools and space to see how impact connects with their values, but also how the institution supports them to do so. And that's why culture is so powerful. When culture supports knowledge mobilization, researchers feel that engaged scholarship is valued and that partners are treated as, or we move further down the road of seeing partners as co-creators, not just these recipients outside the institution. But when people resist culture, when culture resists these new ways of seeing impact and knowledge mobilization, people may comply, but they won't commit. Output gets tracked, but relationships stay largely superficial, and strategy just becomes shelfware. So Reed and Fazy, they have this excellent piece on impact culture that I've just shown the image of here on the bottom left. And they argue that impact healthy cultures aren't just built from the top down. They grow from shared purpose, from those strong commitments, and the capacity to act. And so this idea that it's not about uniformity, but also those subcultures that people work in that lay the foundation for their roles, their values, their relationships. And that's what gives knowledge mobilization staying power. So we really have to be attentive to culture when we're thinking about these plans. Paying attention to time, I think we'll skip this one, but it's a question to think about rather than to type a response to. Thinking about the unspoken norms or beliefs in your institution that might be helping or hindering knowledge mobilization. I see someone typing. If it's helpful to get the idea out, please. But just in the interest of time, I'm gonna move forward. Okay, next, and I hope you're seeing along the way, what I'm trying to do is share some resources that within each of these lessons there's ideas about how you can start to build a plan that respects these lessons. And at the end, I have a resource sheet, so you don't need to write them down or just rely on the slides. There's more. So we often talk about capacity for knowledge mobilization as if it's this infrastructure issue, right? Do we have the people? Do we have the time? Do we have the systems? I can tell you from studying schools, there's never enough time, there's never enough money. But in practice, one of the biggest barriers to institutional K&B isn't logistics, it's literacy. Or in other words, what I mean to say there is that do people across your institution actually know what knowledge mobilization is when they read it in your strategic planning documents? Do they know how it works? Do they know why it matters? And more importantly, do they know their own role in it? At Midland U, again, this composite case study, faculty researchers heard impact, they thought policy briefs. Community partners thought social transformation, and administration thought public relations. No one is wrong in that understanding, but they weren't aligned. And this isn't unique. Across institutions, we see well-intentioned efforts that get tripped up by a lack of shared language, basic familiarity, and institutional onboarding into the world or the domain of knowledge mobilization. And so one of the most useful ways I've found to think about this is through Julie Bailey and David Phipps's impact literacy framework. And their framework, it helps us think about and assess and build capacity across an institutional system. They have what they call the 5 C's listed here. So commitment, is impact and knowledge mobilization visibly supported at all levels of an institution, symbolically, structurally, practically. Think connectivity. So are there active and supportive links between researchers and stakeholders? And you can go through their document. They have not just a definition of each of these, but they also provide a structured way to ask, where are we strong? Where are the gaps? And what would it take to fill them? They have sort of a multi-point checklist you can work through that's really helpful in seeing some of the gaps. And when one of these is missing, the whole system becomes fragile. And what I want to get to is this key idea that impact literacy isn't the job of one person or one office. It's not something you can hire a coordinator to solve. It's not a faculty development workshop once a year. And it's certainly, as much as I mentioned it earlier, it's not an item buried in a grant application or checklist. It's something that's distributed. So it's embedded into onboarding, it's reflected in promotion criteria, it's modeled by leadership, and it's present in the relationships the institution and the people within it have it with communities. And perhaps most importantly, it's understood as a shared responsibility. So that's between researchers, between staff, administration, partners. And we saw I think, a really strong example of this at the University of Ottawa. Again, their plan, which is at this point, I think, moved on. But when we looked at it a few years ago, their knowledge mobilization strategy was treated as a collaborative effort where they brought together administrators, faculty, and staff around a shared table. They offered a clear definition of knowledge users, which helped tailor their supports to different audiences. Their approach focused on building capacity through staged implementation, and it was guided by researcher needs because they first conducted a needs assessment. And it was a really good example of what we call an enabling strategy. It was designed to grow culture and capability across their institution. So just a fantastic example, and one to check out if you haven't seen it before. So this is a quick question. Where is impact literacy strongest in your institution? This is great. We're seeing a range again, once again, some pointing to central office, some pointing to champions are individuals, and that kind of distribution is common in what we're seeing. And there's some great foundations to build from. Okay, so far we looked at strategy, culture, capacity, but even when those pieces are in place, there's one group that makes a quiet, outsized difference, and so those are who I'm going to talk about next. If there's one finding that consistently shows up in knowledge mobilization research, and I think we have some experts in the attendees today, like Dr. Samantha Shuchuk, it's that, but it often gets limited institutional attention. It's that they're the people who operate between silos, who translate across roles, and who hold that sort of relational knowledge across systems are absolutely vital. And those are often called knowledge brokers. They're often invisible, what Richard Watermayer, a researcher in the UK, would call ghosts in the machine. And so the knowledge mobilization is sometimes imagined as a solo act, an individual researcher doing outreach or creating a brief or engaging with the partners on their specific project. But what we see is that in high functioning systems, it's almost always relational, distributed, and facilitated, and a facilitated activity. And it's made possible by those people who bridge those divides. And so this is where the idea of network learning becomes really powerful. And I think through groups like Research Impact Canada, knowledge mobilization professionals can start to share their practices, build their capacity, and grow not just their technical skills, but also their relational judgment. And so this figure here from one of our recent studies shows that effective facilitation really lies at the intersection of both of these pieces, the technical, or how we do knowledge mobilization, and then the relational, who we do it with, and why it matters to them. And at Midland View, again, our composite case, things didn't really take off until they hired their first dedicated knowledge mobilization role. It's not a comms person, not a grant facilitator, but someone whose job it was to connect people, to align efforts, and to advocate across levels. And so that person became a translator, a matchmaker, a memory keeper, sometimes a diplomat. And when they were left unexpectedly, or when they left unexpectedly, what we saw is that everything slowed down because the relationship lived in them. And so this aligns with what we've heard across the Research Impact Canada network, is that facilitation isn't just about transmitting knowledge. It's about building those shared agendas, adapting approaches, and engaging with the values and the communities that help build that culture that we talked about a couple of slides ago. And so when that work is well supported, brokers don't just connect, but they start to build those longer term functions that enable a strategy to really live out its core purposes. And so the question is, how do we avoid that precarity? Because these roles are often surrounded by precarity. Research suggests a few principles. First is legitimacy. So brokers need formal recognition. They can't just be an afterthought or a volunteer or doing it off the side of their desk. They need continuity in connection with that. So their work takes time, months or years, potentially, to build trust with partners. Short contracts and sort of unclear mandates undercut many of their efforts, is what we see. And they also need integration, so that access and alignment across research leadership, community-facing units, they can't be siloed in sort of a niche corner of an institution. And so some institutions are doing this really well through central knowledge mobilization units, others through embedded roles in faculties or research centers, and still others through boundary organizations with community groups. And so it's a real effort, a real point not to overlook. And it, as I said, often is. We're going to skip this one. Sorry, related to time, but the question's there in the slides if you're interested. So please check it out. Okay. We're on number 6. Evaluation is one of the most commonly cited pain points in institutional mobilization. Everyone wants to know, how do we know it's working? But that question is often met with a lot of hesitation, in my experience, and that's because evaluation can feel difficult, it can feel fuzzy, it can feel risky, but you can reframe it. And so at its best, evaluation isn't just about proving value, it's about learning what's meaningful, for whom and under what conditions. And so at Midland View, early evaluation focused on outputs. And this is what we often see: number of workshops, number of policy briefs, media mentions. And that data helped justify the program. But what it didn't do is tell whether community partners found engagements useful, whether research was being taken up in the policy and practice, or whether researchers were becoming more confident in engaging in knowledge mobilization work. And so, in other words, what Midland U was counting, they were counting what was visible, not necessarily what mattered. And so eventually they shifted from outputs to more outcome-focused indicators. So where do we see new relationships formed and sustained? Did partners say the collaboration changed their thinking or practice? Did an initiative lead to uptake or learning? And that kind of shift echoes what we find in our developmental evaluation work with Research Impact Canada, which is when you bring together multiple kinds of data, the quantitative sources with those qualitative sources, and a learning mindset. Evaluation really does become this tool that is for strategic learning and not just this accountability measure. And so when we're saying track to learn, not to prove, it is hard to measure impact, but that doesn't mean we can't evaluate contribution, engagement, readiness for impact. And so there's lots of tools here. There's things like, there's lots of logic models and theories of change. And all of these can help you evaluate in ways that are iterative, developmental, and really not binary or punitive. And here, what I've grabbed and included on the slide is an image from a developmental evaluation where we created a figure to help us understand our work. We used mixed methods and developmental evaluation to generate richer feedback that networks that were engaged in knowledge mobilization can actually make use of in real time. And so our study was on 2 knowledge mobilization networks that, and really what we were trying to do is, again, make evaluation less about a judgment and more about system sense making. So if you have an interest in that, there's some helpful stuff in that article. All right. Let's go from the next there to the next one. Again, I do want to make sure I have time for questions, so I apologize. We're going to skip past this engagement. Here's the last lesson though. This is simple to say, but this one's a little bit harder to embody, especially in institutional life, where planning can feel like the end goal. So the glossy document, the steering committee, the launch webinar, they all create this sort of sense of closure. But knowledge mobilization is never a static problem to be solved, right? The processes of engagement, of learning, of evolution, they're all dynamic. And so your plan needs to really behave accordingly. At Midland U, the turning point came when they stopped treating their knowledge mobilization strategy as a one-time solution and saw it as a living document. So they committed to revising it or revisiting it at minimum annually. They included community partners in their review, and they created a space to ask what's changed, what's working, and where are we drifting. And this mindset is especially important when we start thinking about how we acknowledge what the research shows, that failure in doing this work, which is a word that we'll often shy away from, it's not rare, and it isn't always bad. As we found in a recent study, again, partnered with Research Impact Canada, that failure can range from process breakdowns to bold experiments or sort of hypothesis testing that don't land. And the key is we need to be recognizing the kinds of failure that we're encountering as we're trying new things, what caused it, what it reveals, and building that reflection into how we adapt as a purposeful part of creating and revising these plans. So in many institutions, the idea is that updates to plans are seen as a sign of failure, that we didn't get it right the first time. And that mindset, and what I'm trying to get at here is misaligned with the nature of knowledge mobilization and organizational learning generally. The social, political, community contexts that you're working in, you would know they're always changing and shifting. And so if your plan isn't updating, it's probably not working as well as it could. And so that's why it's really important to build in time to pay attention to these failures. And so the best knowledge mobilization strategy is going to position learning for the institution at the center. Okay. So I, again, want to make space for questions and for conversation here at the end. So I covered a lot of ground, probably fairly quickly. Hopefully the slides and a resource I'm going to share will help take some of this forward in a way that sticks a little bit longer. But I do want to take a moment and pause and again sort of look at the bigger picture. There's those 7 lessons that we talked through, drawn from or connected to one institutional story, but informed by the wider patterns we've seen across the sector, both again in Canada and beyond. And these weren't meant to be followed in sort of a step-by-step process or to be seen as sort of the perfect formula to getting the right strategy. But they are, I think, sort of in the same vein as the DORA's framework that I shared at the beginning there. They're building blocks. And so you can treat them as conditions that help institutional knowledge mobilization become more intentional, hopefully more relational and more sustainable over time. So I'd love to know which of these insights or lessons, which resonates most for you in your context. And you can select more than one, I believe, on this slide. This is great. I really appreciate seeing where these lessons are landing. Hopefully, it also points to the fact that there's no one starting point that'll fit everyone. Almost every institution can find a way in to improved institutional strategy for knowledge mobilization. But the ideas, I'm hoping these can meet you where you are with your institution. Okay. So where might you begin for going on from here? Hopefully you can walk away with something useful. I would suggest, and or maybe I would encourage everyone that to shift from reflection to intention here would be to take a moment to think about what's one concrete step you could take, or maybe one conversation you might want to start, or maybe even just a barrier you're seeing in a new light. And to give that some thought and some consideration. I have a number of questions that hopefully will help with getting there in the next slide. But what I want to leave you with is that you don't need a fully resourced office. These are all nice to have, very nice to have, but you don't need the polished plan or the top-down mandate to grow or to even to begin this work. But what you do need is that clarity of purpose, alignment around values, and care. That's for things like the relationships, the culture, and for learning as you go, knowing that it won't be right, quote unquote, right the first time around. The institutions that we see making the most progress, again, they often start small, but they stay reflective, they stay intentional. And it's that kind of, you might call it something like quiet infrastructure that really leads to the most lasting change. And so just in these last few minutes, I want to share some resources, ways to stay connected. First off, this summary handout to make things easier, I put together. It just revisits those 7 lessons. It's just a 2-pager. You can take it and share it as widely as you like, or not. And I think it could be a helpful conversation starter. It includes some links to tools like like the one that's listed below it, the institutional health check workbook. And at the very least, it could be a conversation starter in research offices or faculty teams, strategic planning groups, and of course, Research Impact Canada has a whole suite of tools that can support some of this work too. And just as some final words before questions, I just want to thank everyone again for bringing time and attention and reflections to this through those polls. This is a messy topic, and it's evolving, and I think that's what makes it exciting. And hopefully you found something useful out of this. And if you'd like to stay connected for anything, questions, resources, or to take any of these forward, please just contact me. And I'm happy to spend a couple minutes talking through questions or having a conversation about any of this.
Stephen, thank you so much. As always, you bring rich insight to this work, which we sincerely appreciate. We are going to end at the top of the hour, and perhaps it is an apology from me in terms of planning. Hindsight gives us 2020, an hour and a half would have been ideal. It's not to say we can't convene at some point down the road for a more fulsome conversation. But I do invite, if anybody does have a question in our remaining few minutes, I suspect we probably have time for about three. But if anybody wants to put their hand up, I'll see if there's a way that I can. Here we go. We've got some in the chat, so that could be. So a question in the chat room, Stephen, do you also engage funding agencies with this subject?
That's a really good question. My work with funding agencies has been a little bit of a lighter touch. But again, actually with my doctoral supervisor from a few years ago, we were looking at funding agencies across OECD and BRICS countries, and we were trying to understand how do they support. It's actually this work was in partnership with Dr. Shuchek in the audience, and we were trying to understand what measures are they putting in place to both support institutions and researchers in doing this work, and to learn from their own efforts in this space. And what we find is that it's a real struggle for many institutions as well. Just recently, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Canada put out a call for research on research, a joint initiative that they're running. And I think what an opportunity, I think they recognize it as an opportunity where there's still a lot we don't know. And one of the things that I'm really keen to learn is hopefully at some point what we could get funded is a study that looks at are all the knowledge mobilization plans and funding that goes to institutions, how are they actually playing out? Who is supporting the efforts in those institutions and the sort of knowledge brokering networks that exist? And so there's, I think, a lot of questions that are still unanswered, but it's something that we're actively wondering about.
Thank you, Stephen. It seems the chat room is becoming the repository for questions, which is entirely fine. There was a question earlier from Don Henwood. You talked a lot about culture. Years ago, William Berquist argued for recognizing 6 different cultures within the academy, and there might be more today. What effective strategies have you seen for acknowledging and bridging those different cultures and fostering collaboration on knowledge mobilization initiatives?
Question. I think I would need to be more familiar with Berquist's work. But I think at a minimum, it is acknowledging bridging different cultures. I think at a minimum, those strategies, if they're a strategy document that it shows awareness for these different cultures at play, requires that sort of as we talked about through that session, brings different people to the table for strategy development and also for understanding the areas in which it's short and or it's falling short and some of the what we can learn from some of the failures of its initial implementation. But beyond that, I think I will take that as a question to reflect on. So thank you for that, though.
Stephen, this may end up being a final question. I know that years ago you presented preliminary work at the Research Impact Canada AGM at your home institution at the University of Calgary. Since then, you've started engaging more broadly in this work with some international scholars as well, and that may be preliminary, but I was wondering if there's any insight you can share with us around where Canada is positioned in relation to other jurisdictions. Are we, I mean, there's obviously more work to do, but are we fairly well positioned? Is it, I'm wondering if you might be able to characterize Canada in relation to others in this space.
Yeah, I think we have some really shining examples, and that's probably the most that I would feel very comfortable stating at a sort of global perspective is that we do have some exceptional examples of institutional strategy that show many of the sort of insights from those lessons. So UBC's plan, the University of Ottawa, the University of Alberta has something a little bit different. Theirs was a statement on research impact. But again, I think it's a nice example of something that's a little bit in different direction from UBC and the University of Ottawa, where they were more knowledge mobilization focused, and the University of Alberta with their first effort towards one of these documents was a university-wide statement on research impact. And I thought they did a really nice job, led by people who are very knowledgeable in this area. So I think what we have are really strong examples to build from, and then of course a network through which we can share some of those things that aren't working, and some of the challenges we have. Because I hope what became clear is that what I can offer, as much as I wish I could, is here's the best way to do it, or here's a way that you can you can guarantee some success from, because it's still very much a nascent area.
Thank you very much. This may be our final question before I close things down in the chat from Rad Fadek. A two-part question, Stephen. How much overlap or differentiation would you expect to see between institutional approaches to KMB versus impact at Midland U or any given academy? And secondly, how would you expect individual researchers to make sense of those subtle shades of difference between these two concepts or activities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is non-trivial to help individual researchers make sense of those, as you say, shades of difference. Okay, to tackle the first part of that question, what would you expect to see between I think at a minimum, at the highest level, it's an understanding of why are we focused on impact continues to raise a lot of alarm bells for many people as a new accountability measure. And so understanding it as something that we can treat like an evaluation information, and an evaluation in the sense of something to learn from. That can help us move somewhere more positively towards, so then how do we get there? And that's where we can open the conversation about knowledge mobilization. I think David has talked about a number of times that if impact is the what we're trying to achieve, knowledge mobilization is the how we get there. And so I think moving or organizing ourselves in such a way that we can help others see that relationship between those concepts. And how do you expect individual researchers to make sense of the subtle shade? I think, again, it has to come from small but meaningful shifts in culture, where we take up broader views of what we mean by impact, and then we start to really show attention to that in things like renewal, tenure, promotion documents, and how we celebrate what researchers and other staff are doing at the institution.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, we're near the top of the hour, and I think I'm going to formally close things off now. On behalf of all of us here live, Stephen, thank you very much for your time and sharing your insights. I think we're all the beneficiaries of your meaningful engagement across our network. So our heartfelt thanks. But to all of you today, you've got choices. I mean, there's not a we're not looking for things to do in this field. So you've made the decision to be here, and this has been a very rich session, which has left me feeling energized and hopeful and grateful. And I think, with the access that we'll have to this resource online, Stephen has provided his email address. I hope this provides some food for thought and continued conversation amongst us. But keep well, everybody. And for those that are outside of Ontario that are enjoying a legitimate spring, I hope you can enjoy that. I'm worried we're going to get to the summer sooner than later, but take good care, and thanks a lot, everybody. Bye now.